Welcome everyone to What the Force. Today we have the Hugo Award-winning author Ken Liu. His works include The Paper Menagerie, The Grace of Kings, The Wall of Storms, and The Legends of Luke Skywalker. Welcome, Ken.
Thank you for having me.
You know, this book hit me kind of in a weird way because I didn't catch it when it first came out before The Last Jedi as kind of the lead up to The Last Jedi. I read it actually back just when I started this podcast. I was like, I'm going to read through some of the canon stuff I haven't gotten to because, I'm a mom, I'm a working person. Like I have other things on the go, but
There's
I read
not
it
enough
and I was
time in the day. Yeah.
yeah, I was like, you know what? I'm going to read it because, this looks like a fun book. And my mind was so blown by it. Like, I was like, is this a kid's book? I was so confused because like there's complex storytelling in it, and I'm just gonna say I read it basically 3 times since I picked it up the first
Awesome.
time. So because and we're gonna get to that, and I guess maybe I should first say to the listener, if you haven't read Ken's book, The Legends of Luke Skywalker, just stop the podcast right now because this is going to be full spoiler. We're going to talk about stuff in detail because I love it. I love it so much. and I've listened to some other kind of people talk about it, and I'm like, do they not get this book? Like, it's so good. What did you
Thank you.
Ken?
I had a great time writing it, and I'm really glad that it worked for you. I've heard from a lot of readers, mostly kids, who I wrote the book for, who really like it, and it's just really cool.
Yeah, and I know it's written for kids, and maybe that's where my brain is at, but
Same here.
It has layers to it. And I think that is so important to acknowledge, that there's this layer that it can tell you kind of the lessons of Star Wars through these almost parable-like stories.
Yeah, that was that was one of the ideas. Yeah, I wanted to do it.
So maybe we should start out by saying, like, what is it like to like get kind of chosen by Lucas, or like how is that process? What is that?
It's super cool. I mean, I've been a lifelong Star Wars fan. I've told this story before, but basically, I fell in love with Star Wars not from the movies, because when I was a small child in China, the movies actually weren't released in China at all. So the only way that we knew about Star Wars was really through the novelizations, some of which made their way through, and also comic books. So my first encounter with Star Wars was through a novelization of The Empire Strikes Back. So it's a very different experience. It was the first really sci-fi / fantasy book I read, and the whole idea of this world with this other galaxy from long ago, far away, and people doing magic and using technology, all in the same universe, fighting evil. It was mind blowing. So I fell in love with it, as a kid that way, and then I became sort of just a Star Wars junkie. I consumed all the books, watched everything. Really loved it, and so to the point where my part of my journey is that when I was in college, there was a time where I was supposed to cram for a final that was going to happen the next day, and I said, I have to do an all-nighter to really study because I hadn't gone to the lectures and I really didn't know what was going on. And then I said, the textbook is so boring. I need to motivate myself. So I went and bought the latest, Star Wars trilogy, the expanded universe. And then I came back, and I said I would just read a chapter of Star Wars to motivate myself as I was studying. Needless to say, the plan did not work. I successfully pulled an all-nighter but did no studying whatsoever. I did finish reading the whole trilogy, and so that morning I had to go run off to take the final exam, and I was just like, oh God, my elementary school teachers were always saying you should not be wasting your time reading these books, and here I am, I'm sort of proving that they're right. But I actually did pass that course, despite the utter lack of studying in favor of Star Wars. And ultimately, I felt like all of that was, a planned journey. Those early steps where I made my choices turned out to be the right choices, because then Lucasfilm Publishing contacted me and said, "Hey, we know that you're a Star Wars fan. Would you like to come and meet with us and talk about some stuff?" That's how it's done.
Say they reached out to you.
Yeah, so I went, and I can't give away the details because all that stuff is NDA'd. But it was an amazing experience. I got to meet with the folks with the Starry group, and the idea for the book got solidified, and I was just like, oh, this is I have a a really, really amazing thing I can do here that sort of culminates my love for Star Wars.
Yeah,
for decades, and I get to be my 8, 9, 10-year-old self again, and to really try to recreate that wonder of the story. That was what that was all about.
That's so great. And so did you end up sort of getting the chance to write a certain point of view first, and then like the story for a certain point of view first, and then the other one?
I did actually end up doing that, and that was really cool too. To be able to participate in that amazing anthology. So for listeners who are not sure what we're talking about, there's an anthology called From a Certain Point of View, which is an anthology of short stories about minor characters or even off-screen characters from A New Hope that
assumed characters in
a way.
Yes.
That gives you a new perspective on what happened during A New Hope. So, and the cool thing about the anthology is that the stories are arranged in there chronologically as they occur in the movie, so that when you read the whole thing, it's as though you've seen this alternate version of A New Hope, where all the perspectives are different, and you get to see the whole story take place from the point of view of different characters, such as the monster in the garbage dump, and things like that, and the little mouse droid. Anyway, so it's just really, really cool. And I got invited to write for that story, so I wrote one story in there, and I had a great deal of fun. That story is slightly different from the Legends of Luke Skywalker, in that the Legend of Luke Skywalker is really about me trying to speak to my 8 to 12-year-old self to try to recreate that wonder of this universe, but with the layers of the journey that I've gotten in between. I mean, one of the themes about that book is this idea that Luke means different things to us based on where we are in our life's journey. Luke himself goes on a great journey from farm boy to Jedi Master, and then, as you know, from The Last Jedi somewhere else. But I think he speaks to us differently depending on where we are in our life's journey. And I wanted to capture a little bit of that wonder in that book. My story from a certain point of view is different, in that for that story, I really wanted to be very silly, and to tell a story about, this thing that I've always wondered, which is, every large modern military runs on paperwork, which has to be true for the Imperial Navy. So what would that be like? So yeah.
And you call it data work, which when I read it, I was like, this is brilliant. And you pulled the best line that people always pull out, which is, what, are we going to run out of lasers? And even though it's a different story, like because it's from a certain point of view and it's kind of silly in its way, there's a lot of that kind of almost meta acknowledgement of the universe that is pulled into Legends of Luke Skywalker, because I think that that's kind of like an acknowledgement and a joke, like, yeah, we see you, you
Yeah,
know?
I mean, I feel like that's kind of important, or I don't want to say inevitable, but I do feel that one of the things that's special about Star Wars is that it doesn't belong. I mean, how do I put this? It feels in a lot of ways like a collective endeavor of myth making. You know, in the way
Mm,
that the old epics are not authored by individuals, but rather
yeah,
they're collective acts of myth making. We don't really have that in the modern world because of
no.
our obsession with, this sort of post Enlightenment obsession with the idea of with this illusion of individual authorship and individual creativity. We tend to view artistic endeavors and creations as the creation of a single individual, when in fact that's almost never the case. But part of the consequence of that is that we don't really have this whole idea of collective myth making. I mean,
It confuses people because, like, I call it iterative storytelling because
yeah, yeah,
that's what
yeah.
it is.
That's what it is.
It's iterations and it changes, and one future story could change the perspective. Like Solo now has changed our perspective of Han Solo. Like,
Exactly.
we aren't familiar with it as a culture, but that doesn't mean that it didn't exist for thousands of years as a storytelling method.
That's right. I mean, we still sort of do it, in the form of fan fiction.
Oh yeah, yeah.
But for Star Wars, I sort of was like, well, one of the unique things about Star Wars is that Lucasfilm Publishing is inviting all these authors who are fans, but who have never written for the franchise before, to come in and do something new. And I think, Disney and Lucasfilm Publishing are consciously trying to make the world more rich and layered by bringing these new perspectives and bring long term fans into the franchise to do this. So, I wanted to acknowledge the fact that it is in some way a collective act of storytelling. So, those little winks towards fandom are there, not because they're throwaways, but in some ways I do feel they're important to the very nature of Star Wars as an act of collective storytelling.
And I feel like there's like this so I refer to it, and I actually did an episode on fan fiction as a fandom to do with Star Wars, because I feel like it's very important to acknowledge that there are these almost canonical keepers, the canonical fans. They want to keep things like in the frame of what exists in canon, and they're like they're always the ones that's not canon. Like, right? And then there's these transformational fans, which it sounds like you and maybe many of the authors is like, okay, let's take Star Wars and see how far we can push it. Certainly, DJ Older, he pushed it with Last Shot, right? Like with all of the new concepts, the diversity of the book itself. And I think Star Wars is ready for that. I think that that's good. And I loved so much about Luke Skywalker, the Legends of Luke Skywalker, because it pushed my own understanding of sort of what I assumed, and as well as concepts about the Force. It reinforced them in like not simple ways, but easy to understand or get my teeth around. Like it helped to reinforce what I had thought for the longest time deep down inside, that oh, somebody else is saying it, but in a different way. And that to me means that I'm getting it, which is great.
It also means that we're participating in the same mythology,
Yeah.
that the mythology lives only because we share that understanding, which is actually I think one of the most amazing things about being a Star Wars fan. It's that you are tapping to a shared mythology, and that you feel that sense of connection with everyone else. I mean, in some ways, the connection between fans and fans is the Force. It's that web that connects all of us, that allows us to feel the same feelings, and to know that yes, that it is possible to be more than just one individual self shut up on an island in the cold. That it is, no matter where you are, there's a way to be connected to the rest of the universe, which I think is, one of the most beautiful things about being a fan.
So, this story is set up in a very particular way. I guess I'll use the word frame story because that's probably the closest thing to it, as well as, so for those that are listening, an example of a frame story would be the Canterbury Tale, where
That's
it's like there's a
exactly right.
story around this story, there's a story through line as the characters within the story are telling these stories. And that's used for a few reasons, usually to give us context to the story that is being told amongst the people. But one thing that I found so interesting about the frame story that you told, so the story about the stories, is that there are more women than men.
I hadn't even noticed that. Is that true?
Yes, there's only, I mean, unless the droid is a male with male programming, all the
There
rest of
are
the
several
storytellers.
droids who have female programming.
Oh, I know. But like this particular one, I don't think you say. So
No, I don't. Yeah, I don't
yeah.
specify for that one. Yeah.
Oh, I forget the name of the character. He's the one who tells the lugubrious moat story.
Yes, it's actually kind of confusing because that story is told third or fourth hand by the
Yeah.
time we hear it.
Yeah. It's so good, but no, I was like, I could read this to my daughter and she could find herself in a variety of the characters there, which
That's
is
cool. Yeah,
so
yeah, that's very
good.
cool.
It's so good. And like I liked that although it was a junior novelization, Lugubrious Moat even calls out that she's going to use big words.
Yes, yes,
and
that's right.
and there's complex vocabulary used to describe situations and the topics. And this is something I've always argued with people about, is that just because it's for kids doesn't mean it can't be serious.
Yeah, I mean, I was
Mm-hmm.
inspired in some ways by my daughters. They are actually just about at the age where these books are, in the target audience of this book. And so when I was writing it, I was really both using my own memory of myself as well as them as a benchmark. I was like, what are the things that they're interested in? What
Mm-hmm.
sort of things would bore them? And then it turns out that big, long, complicated words don't bore them. They love
No.
that stuff, especially when it's presented in a way that they find interesting, silly, or goofy, or just cool. Because a lot of kids love words. I mean, we sort of forget about this, but when you're a kid and you're learning about the world, everything is new, and new words are not you know I have to learn this to sound smart and to do well on the SATs or to impress my boss. That's not the point. The point is that just these words are like toys. They're fun. So I was like, okay, well, this is cool. I know that they both love this sort of things. I'm going to put that in there and to make it fun. And they are able to handle very complicated stories with layers of meaning. We sometimes don't give kids that age enough credit, but they appreciate that kind of layering. They get the multiple layers of symbolism. They get the idea that you can tell a story about fictional people when it still means something about us, and that there can be layers of a palimpsest of stories over stories that all echo to each other and have meaning. So the idea of story within story within story, that all are thematically related is in fact not that difficult a concept for kids to accept. So I was like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, this is fun for them. So I'm going to try to put in things like that.
And I think that some of the best, like I really love spoken word, and when stories can go off and diverge for a while and then come back around, it's that much more satisfying for you to actually
Mm,
see that full cycle of storytelling and the meaning behind it, that diversion actually took and added layers of complexity to the story that was already being told.
yeah, yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So, given that this was part of the journey to the Last Jedi, what did you think of the movie?
I love the movie. I thought it was really great. It's I think one of the amazing things is that it shows where I'm focusing on Luke here, but it sort of shows where Luke ended up.
Hmm.
And it's an interesting question because one of the things I really wanted to get across is this thought that we both tend to worship our heroes, but also to ask unreasonable things of them. We sort of
Mm.
want them to do certain things, and if they messed up in some way, we just sort of decide that they're not heroes anymore, and that's really not how life works. Our earliest heroes are our parents. And part of growing up is to understand that they're terribly flawed people. It does
Hmm.
not mean that somehow that makes them not heroes. It is part of that journey of growing up, of accepting the imperfection of other people, in the same way that we accept the imperfection of ourselves. And to me, Luke Skywalker is the perfect sort of canvas to paint that story out, because he is, in the movies from the very start, a conflicted character, both made into a legend larger than
Hmm.
life, but constantly aware of the fact that he is not that legend. And so the
Mm.
Last Jedi is very much about that. It's about this thing about how the image people have of me is not what I am, and I cannot live up to it. And I can't do any of that. I can't do any of it. But in the end, he ends up accepting that, that's really not the point. We exist on two planes. I'm both person, I'm also this legend. And
Yes.
sometimes it's okay to accept that I can't live up to that, but that doesn't matter because the legend will inspire people. At the end, the stable boys being inspired by the legend of what he did, and in acting out, his legend with these little toys.
Hmm.
That's really kind of the same idea behind the legends of Luke Skywalker. Here's a
Hmm.
character who's larger than life, and I wanted to show what happens to people like that and their stories in a galaxy as complicated surely as ours, and perhaps even more so. And what kind of stories people would tell about him, and in some ways how he himself might react to those stories.
So I know that you might not be able to answer this next question, but I think it's important to acknowledge that, like, I've listened to a lot of reviews of this, I've read a lot of reviews, and some people get very caught up and like back to the canonical nature of the storytelling. And me personally, I take from it, much like parable, I take from it, what are you trying to get at, not necessarily what is actually being said, right? And yeah, but like they struggle with, well, did it really happen, you know
Yeah,
when is it happening, things like that.
this seems to be not terribly complicated to me, as a matter of fact. I mean, we all have gone through elementary school where we read the story about George Washington, the cherry tree. So the question is, did that really happen? Is that actually true? Do we care? We know about Nathan Hale and the whole thing about, I regret that I have but one life to give for my country. Okay, what actually happened? How much of that is actually true? We know, we learn tons of legends like that, but the fact that they may not be true, they may be exaggerated, they may be made up,
Hmm.
it doesn't. That's only one aspect of the inquiry, and to me, the least interesting aspect of the inquiry. The far more interesting inquiry is, what have these legends
Taught.
become in people's minds? What do they
And what are
motivate
they
people
trying
to
to
do?
teach us?
Right. What do
Like,
they
yeah.
motivate people to actually do? And then what have we done with those lessons? I mean, our politics is filled with the sort of legendary character. The early republic used to cite to Roman and Greek senators and important orators all the time. Cincinnatus is such an important character, and all the founding fathers in the early republic is filled with these quotations from Greek and Latin orators, and the fact is, many of the stories they tell are legendary. and we have no idea if they are true or not. But that's not the point. These legends have become a shorthand for how we converse and how we represent important ideas to each other. They are how we talk. And so I wanted to get that sense across from Legends of Luke Skywalker. So, the simple answer for the whole canonical, non-canonical debate is the framing story is canonical. It actually happened. There was actually such a ship, and the characters indeed do tell each other stories just like that.
When does that happen?
That is not something I can answer.
Because to me, I actually posed this to a few friends who had read the book, and I'm like, there is nothing in this book that says that it doesn't happen after episode 9.
To say more would be to
no. But I think that that's what people get stuck about, right? Like, just because it just because it came out before 8 does not mean it happened before 8. Because let's face it, the canon jumps around because it's iterative storytelling.
That's right.
In my mind, this book happens after 9. So thank you, Ken. You can deny it. It's cool.
I put in all sorts of things in there to refer to the very point about Star Wars being iterative storytelling. I mean, we not only do we have the fact that iterative storytelling is something that we do, but even the creator, George Lucas himself has
iterated
iterative storytelling. So we know. I mean, there's a whole little reference in one of the stories to this whole pawn shop first business, but that's really the tip of the iceberg. I mean, if you go back and look at the movies, you'll see that what happened in the original theatrical release. There are just a few stormtroopers on the Death Star, but in the later ones, you see Han and runs around the corner, and there's this hallway filled with stormtroopers. You compare the two scenes, and it's like, okay, what happened here? One explanation is, well, that's what happens. This is what happens when legends grow. This is 2 stormtroopers became 200. That's the way the nature of storytelling works.
And you even put it into super sharp focus in the Mythbuster with the different DVD releases, the expanded edition of, A New Hope with the Death Star exploding and her talking about the 2 different Death Stars exploding.
Right.
I was like, oh my God, I love you, Ken.
She's one of my favorite characters because, she's the great conspiracy theorist, but she's so convinced that she's right? She's like, not all of you are sheeple. You are not actually paying attention to reality. Let me show you. How could this have happened? There was a cover up. This is a conspiracy. She just goes on, and everything in the universe fits into her worldview. But the funny thing is, sometimes in the real world, things are not absolutely explainable. There are just mysteries like that, and they provide great fodder for conspiracy theorists. I mean, in this particular case, clearly the conspiracy was incorrect, to say the least, as far as what actually happened. But it's fun to sort of imagine how that kind of theorizing would become part of the galaxy, because surely people would not in fact believe the official version of any of the stories. They would come up with no explanations. You can imagine this is what would have happened, that the truthers are going to be out there and then doing all this stuff. So
well, and I loved that this really it almost teaches kids about primary sources. In a weird way, it's like R2-D2 is actually a primary source.
That's right.
But even though the droid that tells the iDroid story could be potentially a primary source, there's questions about whether that story was changed or adapted over time or even taken as parable, which I really do think it is. And oh man, I know I said in the email when I asked you to come on the show, I was like, I love this story so much. So I want to spend a good amount of time on that one. But maybe if we could just kind of briefly talk about each of the stories and kind of the messages and things like that, because I think that they're very important. So first, the overall frame story itself on the Wayward Current,
Yep.
we have basically teenagers living
Mm-hmm.
their lives, and their hard lives. They're like stable hands on a ship, which, could have been set in on Earth as like a,
The Age of
bringing,
Sail. Yeah.
yeah, Age of Sail. Like, it felt very familiar, and yet Star Wars, which I love. I love the idea of using not these tropes, but this sort of storytelling where it's like this could have been set any time and place, but happened to be Star Wars.
Yep. 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 Absolutely.
And what I loved the most about the frame story is that it re-acknowledges the shared mythology that everybody is connected to the Force. It's not just Force users.
Right. Right. Which is something that I think has been presented unevenly in canon, but it's an important concept to me. Yeah.
It's important to me too, and they've pulled it out more in sort of, I would say, like the book canon, right? So
Mm-hmm.
the
Absolutely.
novelizations and the novels out there, that's been acknowledged more, because they can, like, Jason Fry's novelization that everybody's part of the Force. It's called out several times in, like, even Stormtroopers I feel that Kylo Ren is pissed off. Like,
That's right. That's right.
it's called out several times in canon, but it's nice to see it in an acknowledgement that, hey, the Force brought us together. And that's just an undercurrent of the galaxy, the Star Wars universe that they live in, and that
Mm-hmm.
people need to maybe stop putting a line in the sand of where the Force starts and where the Force begins, that it's all just Force users that have the Force.
Well, not only that, but I mean, I think again, you can map this to our own understanding of the world. I mean, many of us are spiritual and we follow different spiritual
Mm-hmm.
traditions, and you can argue that these traditions all describe different aspects of the same supernatural reality, or perhaps they are all incompatible. But how
Mm-hmm.
can you draw the line exactly between fate and coincidence? I mean, you can
Yeah.
argue all you want, but the reality is when you live your lives, you can't tell the difference, and
Mm-hmm.
we accept that. If you can accept that in real life, what's so
Mm-hmm.
hard about accepting some ambivalence and ambiguity in the fictional universe? I never understand the difficulty people have with keeping potentially incompatible ideas in head, because we do that in real life all the time.
Yeah. And it may take us our whole lives to actually come to some sort of realization of these incompatible ideas that fits with our own framework. But
Mm-hmm.
that's okay. That's what life is all about. That's the very Joseph Campbell, trying to figure it all out. What the point of storytelling and the stories that we tell ourselves is to
Absolutely.
help us work through it.
And again, accepting that we cannot explain everything and cannot
Yeah.
in fact master everything. That's the whole point. I mean, Luke's lesson is I cannot master everything, and that's that's okay. Sometimes it's time to let go.
Yeah. No, and I love that we really get to see these stories kind of through the eyes of these younger persons who are trying to figure it all out too, because that's very Star Wars as well.
It is. Star Wars is fundamentally, I really believe this. Lucas says something about the ultimate, the mood, the key emotional note in Star Wars is this effervescent giddiness.
Yes.
I think that's what it's about, and we shouldn't forget it. It doesn't mean that other emotional notes are not in there as well, but this is the dominant one, and it is the note of childhood, and I believe very much in maintaining it.
So, to talk about the Mythbuster and
Yep.
Reddy,
Yes,
who's the
ready.
engineer, right?
Yes.
So this story is the first story that's told, and it's told by Ulina, I believe. And I first listened to the book because and January Lavoie, who did the reading, she is wonderful. I will listen to like any book. And I tend to do this like when I don't have time to read, like sit down and actually read, because like sitting down is like a commitment, whereas I can like listen to a book while I'm doing dishes or, driving places or, but she did such a wonderful job. And Reddy herself is this skeptic, like you said, and like this
Yes.
truther, and she's caught all the things, but in a way, it also sort of represents two things that I want to kind of call out and then maybe have you talk about, which is like these, again, canonical keepers who need to have everything fit and fit in line, or they need to have things make sense in Star Wars,
Yes.
right?
Yes. Yes.
As well as the people who grew up like yourself on the Timothy Zahn, you know, expanded empire after Return of the Jedi, and all of that life, and it's almost like an apology to them in a way. Like it's like, hey, we know these were the stories that you were used to, and this is how you viewed the world, but you know, bear with us, and we're not going to say that your view of the world is wrong. And even Luke says that, like, why would I ruin their fun?
Right.
You know, like, why would I ruin their fun that they enjoyed these stories, and stories are still good. And like, we've gotten this message over and over. And what I love to do is like hear, like, just like absorb what the story group has told me in the variety of different media. Like, we get it from Ahsoka in Rebels. There's always a bit of truth in Legends.
Yep.
There's still things to learn from the old legends, but we have to move on because the story had to shift and had to adjust. It was written in the 1970s. Like,
That's right.
the world has changed. Yeah.
I mean, yes. Lots of things have changed. Right.
Yes. Yeah. So, I mean, what I really appreciated, it was like, no, this is almost like a little love letter to fans who, please accept the new canon. It's good, but also, we're not going to say that your old canon was bad. It was just, it is what it is, right?
That's right. That's right. I mean, I had a lot of fun. I actually, was an engineer, and
Oh,
so I'm very familiar with this, engineer's perspective on things. I not saying that this is, in any way unique to engineers, but I did know many engineers who would like the world to work in the way that engineering projects work, and things need to fit in a certain way. And the fact is, there was a period of time where I actually really enjoyed following up on conspiracy theories and to understand how people spin them and why they believe them and why they really devote so much of their energy to it. And then I think it does require a certain personality type to want to devote a huge amount of energy to apparently insignificant details. And the funny thing is, this kind of dedication to details, to trying to make things make sense, is not a bad thing at all. It often is actually the way to figure out the truth. It often actually is the way to discover things that other people don't want you to find out. The problem is, when you're going down the rabbit hole, it's very hard to tell which way you're going. Are you actually going towards the truth? Or are you just going down to a self-contained world of self-referential simulacrum of truth? It's impossible to tell at the moment when you're going down. And by the time you have ended up where you are, it may be too late for you to get out of that illusion that you spun around yourself if you didn't get to the truth. So I wanted to, tell a story about a fun story, really, if I can, about what that would be like. This is somebody who is convinced that she is smarter than everybody else in the room. She is convinced that, I've been with admirals. I used to work at the best university. I know exactly. I know all there is to know about politics and how things work. And I will tell you with evidence, what really happened on the so-called Death Star. And all the rest of it. And then, I wanted to have some fun with that. And I think the real key of the story, of course, is at the point where we find out that Luke probably was actually among the audience that she's telling out the story to. And Luke's reaction is the key. Luke's reaction is, why should I step out there and stop her? Because this doesn't actually hurt things. It's a story. And the whole point of it is, under the Empire, they wanted to tell one story and have everybody tell the same story. That is not what this is about. What the whole point of this rebellion is so that people can tell different stories, and let them figure out what will get them to closer to the truth. This is not the story that I lived. This is a story that is, not true. But I'm not going to establish that by stepping in and arguing with her. That's not how this is going to work. And so, let her tell the story. I'm going to go on to live my life, and do what I need to do. And I thought that was, important. That's the sort of thing Luke would do.
It's so important, and it does several things in canon. It says, well, hey, he might have been there, he might not have been there, but it also says, like, and I hate to use the word canon because it's like, to me, it doesn't really matter because what you get out of it is so much more important. But also for ourselves, this is like the start of it. It's like these little stories that, kids get told and they're not real, but that's okay. And, their own interpretation of events, as long as they're kind of moving forward and taking what they need from it, that's okay.
Right. And also, there's that bit about how we have these arguments about, our midichlorians are a good idea. What happened there? Who was thinking, is this canon? Is this canon that we have to reluctantly accept? What version of that scene should we actually believe is true? And I guess my point here somewhat is the debates are fun. The debates are great. They are how we act as fans. But I'm not sure the debates are really important to resolve one way or the other, because these incompatible truths are all true in some way. And it's okay for the story to have multiple versions. This is not a bad thing. The fact that there are a multiplicity of versions and interpretations is what allows us to all feel part of this fandom. And you can take the version that you believe is true, and in that act of defending your version of the truth, you are participating very importantly in that collective storytelling, like Reddy was.
Exactly, yeah. And that's kind of part of the role. I apologize. I said it was Ulina, but it was actually Daoism.
Yes, the cook.
Yes. Yeah. Daoism told this story, and then we kind of move on, and everybody's feeling like they want to hear more stories about Luke Skywalker, and it seems to be the theme of the night. And we get one from Ulina about the Starship Graveyard, which is about Jakku, which I found to be awesome. And a kind of different perspective of Jakku, although some people who have played maybe Battlefront, like the video games, have seen kind of part of it, like in that storytelling. And like it all gets summarized through the whole story of this Imperial gunner's perspective. And like, people get caught up in the language. Like, this guy obviously had a concussion.
Yes, exactly. Oh boy. I mean, there's a lot of planning there about that's why we may not trust everything the officer says. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. And like, Luke Skywalker reached out of the sky and pulled these Star Destroyers.
We know that's how he fights. That's not how he fights. So we have to think about why this was the story. I mean, I think the part of the point of this story is you got to understand how Luke appears to the Imperials. He is this amazing wizard who does terrible things. This is a Jedi war criminal who does terrible things. And I think to give a sense of how an Imperial views this legend is fun. It's something that we haven't seen too much of.
Yeah, we get the best line that I think that everyone needs to take from this book, which is, "We are all Luke Skywalker." We can all fulfill the need of a legend when called upon, when we need to be that hero. The person that saved the Imperial officer on Jakku probably was not Luke Skywalker. There's too many things.
Yeah, the story gives many, many hints that is likely not the case. Yes.
I mean, we tend to, here, and this is something I picked up on, there's a lot of interesting language used throughout it. Like you use fish and waves and tide, and kind of spread throughout the different stories
Yep.
in reference to things. You also use the 5 red stripes to kind of
Mm-hmm.
indicate that maybe this was actually Luke.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Maybe. And we
Mm-hmm.
don't
Mm-hmm.
get that in this story. We don't get any kind of 5 red
Yep.
stripes to indicate
That's
that
right.
this was
That's right.
actually him, and or at least like some grain of truth that was him. So but I think that that's what's really amazing about it, is that this random stranger saved this person's life, even though he says he's not a fan or a favorite of the Imperials. He still does something selfless and risks his own safety and his own life to save this complete stranger who in a different circumstance would kill him.
Right.
Yeah,
That's right.
it's really wonderful.
I really had a lot of fun working on that story because I wanted to, mixing some entirely different kinds of legends that are,
Mhm.
as you know, about the whole idea of we're all Luke Skywalker. The story of Luke Skywalker is interesting. It's not that all of us are going to end up doing exactly what Luke did. That's not the point. The point is that what he did have lessons that are applicable to all of us in terms of how to be brave and how to actually
Mhm.
use our legacy and our talents in a way that benefits the universe and makes
Mhm.
everything just a little bit better.
And make the choice to actually do something,
Mm-hmm.
rather than kind of sitting by the wayside, and that's really important.
Mm-hmm.
And now we come to Fishing Deluge, which is told by
That's right.
Flux, who's the stowaway on the Wayward Current.
That's
Um,
right.
and I I think that most people say that this is their favorite of the stories. And it's because it kind of feels the most true, maybe the most primary source, if Flux is actually from that planet,
Right.
right?
It's the story that's closest to um, the teller is closest to the
Yeah.
audience. Yes.
Yeah,
Mhm.
exactly. And so many people just kind of gravitate towards this story, as well as there's several things that I just kind of want to call out. And it's okay if you can't acknowledge them and you can just say, I can't. And I hope I've done a pretty good job of digging into your book, Ken, to this point and gotten a good amount. I know I probably
Yes,
haven't
of
gotten
course.
everything, but I love this book, so I read it like a lot. And I'm like, at points I was like, am I wearing a tinfoil hat? I feel like a crazy.
Are you being ready now?
Am I ready? Yeah, no, because and like I want to say, like Reddy's story set me up. Like it set me up so bad to be blown away by these other 3 stories in a row. I was like, what is he doing to me? Oh my God. As I read this book, I'm like, I kept on picking it up as soon as I got the hard copy, and I was like putting it down and being like, what? What? Like, and maybe it's just me. Am I ready? I don't know. But the thing about themes is that when they happen more than once, you're trying to say something, author person.
Right.
And I like your giggle, but I know that you're probably not going to be able to. So, first, Fishing in the Deluge is just a wonderful short story about another planet that feels like you've expanded the world of Star Wars. It's like just on its surface, it's detailed and visceral and full of danger, and yet also full of this concept, very Taoistic,
Mhm.
of the tide, and that, like, why do you try to subscribe dark and light to something that just is, you
Yep.
know? And I actually recently just recorded an episode with a religious studies professor about the Eastern religion sort of, taken and adapted. And there's a lot of Western religion too in Star Wars, but
Yeah, that's the
Taoism,
appeal. It takes from many traditions.
many traditions, and then adapts them. But Taoism, especially with to do with the tide, and that it just is, and that you have to find your center within that. And wow, it was mind blowing to actually see it written in such a again, not simplistic way, but easily digestible way for kids.
Mhm.
And for adults who seem to have missed the point of Star Wars this whole time.
I think oftentimes we sort of miss one of the key ideas about the prophecy about Anakin. It's about
Hmm.
bringing balance to the
Hmm.
Force. And if we speak in terms of defeat the dark side only, then that's not necessarily bringing the balance.
Oh, I'm
And
going
then
to come
I,
back to this so
yeah.
much in
So
iDroid.
so I wanted to point out that you really have to understand that when the Jedi say these things, they mean something. There's
Mhm.
something about the balance, and in fact, it's possible that the Jedi in the time of Anakin have forgotten what that means as
Yeah.
well. That
Yeah.
that may in fact be their downfall. That they have forgotten what it means to have balance in the Force. It's not entirely their fault
No.
because the Sith also do not understand it. But the fact that they are both terribly arrogant and do not in fact understand what it is that they're trying to do doesn't mean that we can't try to intuit and see a little bit of what it is Yoda and Luke ultimately are trying to do
Hmm.
with this idea of bringing balance to the Force.
So when you speak about the balance, what do you mean?
So here's the thing. I'm going to be very, very careful about this. um, I think if the idea of balance can be easily described in a couple of sentences, then there's no need to build a whole universe and write lots of stories about it. You know what I mean? Like,
Yes.
I think
Yes.
it's one of those things where abstract summaries are not as useful as experiences. I feel like
Mm.
the whole idea of Zen Buddhism and
Hmm.
Daoism, which are very closely related because they draw from very similar root traditions, is the idea that sometimes these things, you know how there's this whole idea, not just in Zen Buddhism and Taoism, but also in esoteric Christianity, especially the aesthetic
Hmm.
practices back in the early era. A lot of the Christian mystics really believe this idea that of this sudden revelation, sudden understanding. And we have made a we've lost sight of what that actually means. It's not that you just sit there and suddenly you understand everything. It's that you actually have to experience a lot of things in life. You
Hmm.
have to actually go through a lot of suffering. You have to actually see how your own arrogance fails. I mean, St. Augustine is, a great example of this sort
Hmm.
of Christian philosopher. His entire thing is about this is a journey. This is a journey. You don't come to God or to wisdom just by pure luck. That's not how it works. You have to experience a lot of life
Hmm.
and you have to experience a lot of pain before you understand something about it. In some ways, St. Augustine draws on the pagan tradition as well.
Hmm.
But it's the same idea here. What I think matters about balance is not something you can explain in a decree from the Jedi High Council. It's not something that Qui-Gon can explain in just a couple words.
Yeah.
The reason he can't is the whole point. I mean, look, we have this tradition in Star Wars of teachers, of masters, not being able to actually instruct their students that much. They
Hmm.
spend a couple of days, a couple of weeks to instruct, and they're just gone. That is not enough time to teach these important lessons. I think that's the key to
Hmm.
a lot of the stories of Star Wars. It's precisely because there's not enough time to do it that things get screwed up, and even when there is enough time, like with Ben, it doesn't always work.
Yeah.
Sometimes these lessons cannot be
He just
taught
needed,
in.
he needed to experience life, I think,
Yes, yes,
and actually, like, because there's only so much you can actually learn in school. You have to
yes.
actually live your life to actually understand the lessons that your parents and your school and your religion, if you
Yes.
are religious, was trying to teach you, because it's in practice that you actually see the lessons.
That's exactly right. I mean, Yoda is a Jedi Master after hundreds of years. People forget that. He did not become the Master. With the first couple of years of his life. It took a long time to get
And
there.
he still made mistakes.
He still made mistakes, And so, in terms of idea of balance, I don't think it's the sort of thing that can be summarized that way. It is, in fact, what Luke spent all his life trying to understand. What does
In
it
fact,
mean to say?
in the story, he has to make an entire journey around the entire planet to understand that not only is the balance the constant effort of trying to maintain it, but also the attempt to uplift and get to your destination. It's really fascinating, and it's his own experience in that moment that is the balance, and not what I see and what I can interpret, because balance is very personal to me.
Yes, that story also, all the stories do, but that story also has quite a few foreshadowings of what happens in The Last Jedi.
Yes, it does.
Right. So I think part of that is to try to give viewers a different kind of understanding of what it means when he made his choices in the end, both to be alone on the island and also why he decided to join again, and the manner in which he decided to join.
So I knew fish was important when you kept on bringing it up in the book.
Right.
And so you get the 3 lessons that Luke is trying to teach in The Last Jedi, and actually one got cut from the final editing, but you do hear it in Jason Fry's novelization. You do hear the 3rd lesson. So you actually told everybody the lessons before The Last Jedi even came out, which is, light and the dark are both part of the tide. The Force has a greater, is greater than an individual, i.e., the Jedi's failure was hubris. They don't own the light.
They don't own the light. Yes.
Yeah. And then sometimes yielding to the tide, i.e., the Force, is not surrender. It's connecting yourself with something larger, which is so wonderful. Thank you, Ken. Let's talk about that Marlin.
Okay, let's talk about that Marlin.
That Marlin is Kylo Ren. And I'm going to tell you why. Because nobody fishes with a kilometer-long fishing pole. And that was a representation of the Force projection that Luke used to get to Crate to have a fight with Kylo Ren and lets him go.
I love that interpretation. That is awesome. I love it.
Thank you for acknowledging and not acknowledging.
I'm going to go with it.
Well, also, where he gets stabbed is quite literally where his scar is. I mean...
That's true. That's true.
There's things, and you keep on mentioning fish. And waves and things. So I knew it was important. I don't know. Maybe I'm not. I don't think I'm that much smarter than other people. I just read things with like a ready type style, and then actually try to take a step back and be like, was that crazy or was that on purpose?
Or sometimes it's
my own experience, right? Like,
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thank you for the super non-acknowledgement, but cool. I'm gonna get a lot of that with iDroid. I can already tell. All right, let's briefly talk about Lugubrious Moat and the Big Inside.
Which is one of my favorite stories.
I loved it.
It's meant for the 8-year-old me.
Well, and this Lugubrious Moat story, and we are skipping over what is my favorite story of the book, because I want to deep dive into it with Ken. So just listeners, bear with me. And I'm sure that there's some sort of reason for all of these being in the order that they are. Mainly Lugubrious Moat is this like very light story after a very, very serious iDroid story.
That is true.
So it's almost like a palate cleanser before you get into...
Yeah, you can't go just heavy all the time.
Yeah, like it's a palate. So it's almost like Lugubrious Moat is a video game operator. And she is this mote of dust that exists on Salacious Crumb. And
one of the best Star Wars names ever.
I know. And so it all takes place, and it's almost like a retelling of the Jabba Palace scene. And Leia's the only one that gets it, quote unquote, which is...
That's right.
Wonderful. And basically, Lugubrious Moat helps Luke be the Jedi he needs to be in the moment. Right. And a lot of this I take as, this is us, putting ourselves in the place of the story heroes, in that imagination world, like you said, 8-year-old us reliving that moment as, you know, the fulfillers of this story, which is just great.
Yep, it's what we would like to do. We would like to be in that position where we are the actual heroes, you know, who make it happen. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's so cute, and it's just fun. I suspect that it will be my kid's favorite because we've just started reading the book together, and you know we can only get like so many pages a night.
A lot
So
of kids like that. Yeah, that is what I wanted to do. Yeah, I know I would have loved it when I was a kid. That's the sort of thing I wanted. It's the sort of fantasies I experienced. Yeah.
exactly, and it does have this very video game feel to it. Like Lugubrious Moat uses her legs and like suckers to like control Luke
Yep.
and like, you know, do all of the methods, and she can't even understand how he's able to use the force at points, which is
Right.
just really great.
She actually is, you know, this total rationalist. She's just sort of like, oh, there's no force. Force is ridiculous. But since
Yeah.
he believes it, I will go along with this, you know.
Use the force, she says to him. Yeah, no, it's just a really wonderful and cute story. And again, large vocabulary of words to select from if you're trying to teach your kids words that are outside of the norm. They'll get it because it's all in context. And then they'll start using them, and their teachers will be like, where did they learn that word? And then the next one is The Big Inside, which...
Yep.
Oh, Lordy, this story. So, it's in a space slug, which is so cool and is graphic in its description of going through these layers. And I mean, can I tinfoil hat you and say this almost feels like they're going back in time?
A little bit. It's
Yeah.
I mean the very motto of it is in fact Journey to the Center of the Earth.
Oh,
you know,
yeah, I
sci-fi
got
classic.
that. Yeah.
And so as you remember, that story is in fact a story about going back in time in some way as you're going.
Yeah, because they go and they see the dinosaurs and they see
Yep.
the different kind of because they go through and they see like creatures, bigger creatures, and then they see smaller creatures, and then they see kind of this primordial ooze
That's right.
stuff. Yeah, until they're at the beginning.
That's right. And in this story, you know, Luke is looking for Jedi artifacts to try to find out the Jedi, you know, the first temple and to learn more about the Force. And so here he is. He goes through the inside of a planet or asteroid-sized creature and learn something about the past and about another tradition of the Force. Amusingly, not only does he learn something about the past in the grand tradition of Jedi and other Force users, but he learns something important about his own past. He comes to terms with his teacher's sacrifice in a way that he was never able to before. So
Obi-Wan giving up his life to save him, and in some ways too, Yoda like not being able to last any longer to teach him and things like that. Like these teachers lost their lives along the way, and in The Last Jedi, he chooses to take that path.
It's a setup for that, right? Yeah.
Which was really great. And I love the Force concepts that you introduced. And it's a different take on the same thing, a different way, a different lens to view the Force through, which is, the mist and this idea that it's actually something that can be turned physical is almost like the Force magic that we see in the Clone Wars. And it's just this, like, it feels... it's just a very different interpretation than we've seen, which is really wonderful.
Yep. And there's also, this idea of these Force users of being able to maintain themselves in a cocoon of time, where they're frozen, where they're not moving, not changing. That's, of course, a metaphor as well for, where the Jedi may have gone wrong and what they may have forgotten. So you can sort of think about what does it mean when Luke, plunges the lightsaber in to both free them but also to let them rejoin the movement of this universe. And what does it mean in terms of what he did for burning down the books and consigning one aspect of Jedi tradition to the past.
Yeah, and it does state something kind of about our world too, which is that if we are constantly stuck in the past and what should be because of the past, we can't move forward and actually experience the change and grow and become free.
And again, there's the question of balance. Is balance about just preserving the past, or is it about throwing everything away, or is it something else?
Kind of in the middle. Oh God, this book is so good. All right, now on to my favorite thing ever, which is this book,
the Joy story. Yes, which takes on lots of new meaning in terms of Solo and so on. Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Like not just Solo. So I do a segment actually called Deconstructing Droids, and on that I actually asked, not reading this book first, I was like, I just need a droid rebellion. Like a good droid rebellion. And since that point, I got this story about Zeta, and I got Last Shot, which is kind of a different take on a droid rebellion. Totally. And then I got Solo, which was so wonderful as far as the droid rebellion. I really love L3. Some people didn't like how she ended up playing out, but I think it's really great. Like, you know, you're not always going to like the heroes that end up saving the day.
You're not,
you know? But let's talk about Zeta. Ken, I was struck by I really wanted to see this, and it really thematically shows how dark and deep this cycle of tragedy that the galaxy was under, and that it was a self-perpetuating cycle of abuse, right? As more droids were used up, the lords and ladies of the gem would go and get more droids to fulfill those ranks. And it's like an analogy for the galaxy in general. Yes. Because under the war, I'm going to go deep, and then you can stop me as much as you want. But the words that are used, and this is probably one of my favorite short stories I have ever read. The words used to describe the deep, and maybe I should go into a mini summary.
That would help, so people have
so people have a concept. So Zeta is a droid of function. She's a construction droid. She clears land and she helps build. She is 3 meters by 3 meters by 3 meters. That is massive. Unrealistically massive for in a mine, but that's okay. She's literally a mystery box. He's nodding. You can't hear it.
Go on.
But he's nodding. So she's literally a mystery box. And she ends up getting captured by these slavers and sacrificing her own self, her own power, basically getting a limb taken away to save her friends as she's captured by slavers. She gets taken to this weird world where they use droids to dig this resource, which is used for everything to maintain this society, this societal ideal that floats above this dark mining planet, which is called the Deep.
Yes.
And the gem is where all the lords and ladies live. Oh my God. Okay, so I'm reading this. And I'm like, okay, this is cool. And then Zeta runs into, on this slaver ship, as these lords and ladies are trying to select their droids, this little droid who's R2-D2, happens to be R2-D2 along the way, who, tries to basically communicate with other people and tries to remind them of who they are. And, he's a good droid. And these lords and ladies struck me as very weird. They were like, the Lord himself uses, Lord Kikian
Mm-hmm.
or Ulecki. That's Lady Ulecki.
That's AD,
I think I'm
yes.
yeah, I'm pronouncing them correctly. um, so the Lord himself uses speeches and
Long speeches, in fact.
long speeches and like do what's right. And the lady, to control these droids to get them to mine or to enforce their will, uses direct intervention, the override chip, i.e., plugging something into the droid that makes them have dark thoughts. All right, let's just stop there because Zeta ends up becoming one of these enforcers and is first tried to convince by the Lord to do the thing that's right, and then is overrided with these dark thoughts. And the dark thoughts are almost exactly how Vader describes his situation in Lords of the Sith from his own brain.
Yep.
So this, I'm like reading. I keep on putting the book down and being like, "What is going on? What are you doing to me, Ken?" The lords and ladies are the Sith and the Jedi.
Right. They are in fact a metaphor for
Yes,
what is happening. Yeah.
and the deep is the galaxy under the cloud of the dark side.
It's the trials and tribulations
Yes,
of
because it's
yeah.
how Yoda describes the galaxy. It's under the cloud. It's everything is clouded with the shadow of the dark side, and it's how he described it. And the override chip makes you an enforcer, which is very close to force user.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And here's the thing. I mean, you often we're often asked this question: how do dystopias, maintain themselves? How they seem to make no sense. How is this even possible? Well, it's possible because you only need to control a very small number of people to amplify your force and to
Mm-hmm.
multiply it sufficiently. That's how all of these systems work. That's what the emperor wanted. That's what the first order does. And in this case, that's how the gem controls the deep.
Yep.
And Zeta is one of the individuals who is coerced into the system of being the oppressors. Um, um,
And which is like either the Jedi or the Sith caught up in
mhm.
this cycle, subscribe to the mandates of the society, the gem, of how to continuously draw tear opals, i.e., the pain of the galaxy sustains these two flawed institutions.
That's right. The
What?
two institutions, especially, right? They make these grand speeches about sacrifice,
Mm-hmm.
about the sublimation and crystallization of higher ideals, right? I mean,
Yeah.
you hear this sort of thing from the very arrogant Jedi that we meet in the prequels, and you hear this sort
Yeah.
of thing from the Sith all the time. None of them are there to say we are evil because we are evil. We
No.
just want to do evil. They all have some higher ideal they believe they're in pursuit of, which is kind of the reason why these things work in the first place. You know.
Yeah, no, and Zeta herself, who I love, and we get this wonderful insight from her perspective, and it's very Anakin like, and
Yes, exactly. You
in
see the Anakin. Yes, that's the
yes,
point.
but it goes past that, Ken. I'm just gonna say, at one point in the story, so at Zeta ends up like feeling trapped by this override chip, which is very much a fall to the dark side. And it's described as the dark. It's like the I'm trying to find the right word. the I have it in a note, but it's like these dark my brain is totally gone. I'm so sorry.
It's okay. We'll come back. Dark.
Yeah, but like these dark thoughts that take her over, and like she ends up killing one of the droids and just chucking them into the poison lake
But
and
notice
things like that.
right, the key for me in this passage is that's how it started, but then she becomes her own enforcer, right? In order
Oh
to
yeah,
avoid thinking about it, she decides to just
she becomes
go
the
with it.
best enforcer.
Right. So this is how it
Yeah.
happens, right? It's a metaphor for what happens to Vader and to other folks in that kind of position.
Yeah.
You can perhaps
I
see
would say like
Kylo.
it's a
Yeah.
yeah, it's a good. Oh, you said it. Great. I didn't have to say it. You can see these dark force users, like they're kind of stuck in this perpetual cycle of these dark thoughts that override their good thoughts. Like they want to be good, but it's almost too painful to make that journey back up because of what's preventing them. So they end up becoming the best bad guys out there,
Mm-hmm.
or the most successful bad guys, because it's easier. It is the
Mm-hmm.
easy path.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's really
It's
neat.
it's it's both the easier path, but also in some ways the path they feel is in some way truer. You know, they can avoid having to confront something that they don't
Yes.
want to confront, and perhaps confrontation is just too hard, and they can't do it on their own. You
Yeah.
know, that's what happens with Anakin. That's what happens.
This story is what made me think, what if this is actually a parable of the whole saga after 9? Because we get this dark force user who at one point ends up Luke, because this is all about Luke. Luke ends up kind of sneaking in to try to save R2D2 from the mines. And Zeta doesn't get caught off guard by this at first because Luke speaks to Zeta, and we're quote unquote Luking it because it could be Luke with the 5 stripes, or it could
Sure.
be some grain of truth about Luke.
Sure.
So Luke sneaks in.
Let's go with Luke for now. Yes.
Yeah, Luke sneaks in, and he's in the body of a protocol droid, and he totally sounds like C-3PO, which is kind of wonderful. And like is like this is what Luke thinks C-3PO is like.
Exactly. It's what he thinks C-3PO is like, which is kind of hilarious.
It's just so wonderful. I'm like crying because it's so wonderful. So he sneaks in and he speaks to Zeta to like sneak past her with, getting a good suit on and stuff like that, using binary and referring to the maker. And these things about droids, like I'm obsessed with the world of droids because it's so complex and interesting, and literally nobody cares about it. And what it represents, because like speaking in binary is like speaking in words of family, because it's like the truth or what you were born to. It's also speaking to your truth of who you are, right? And Zeta actually calls that out. It's like, this droid talked to me in binary, which is the right way, the the respectful way,
That's right.
and yeah. And then there's also like talking about the maker, which is that concept in and of itself is so interesting. Like the maker itself, we don't know a lot about the maker other than when they kind of call it out in now, that it's something that has been built into people this whole long, which could be, an analogy for the Force from a droid perspective.
Could be, yes.
Could be. Yeah, we don't know yet. And what the droids kind of view as the creator and how they function. It's just like there's so many things that I haven't even digested. To your point earlier, like this is going to take me years to kind of fully get, but I think I've gotten a lot of the really cool metaphors, at least.
Yeah, it's really cool that you saw it as what it is. I mean, it is a metaphor for the larger struggle of the galaxy and the state in which the galaxy is. Yeah.
And we get to the point where Luke is trying to communicate with R2D2 and kind of pull him out of his situation, and Zeta finally notices this. Oh, it was the dark compulsion. Oh, I love that. Sorry, It took me a minute to remember. The dark compulsion overwhelms Zeta, and she needs to destroy Luke. And it all comes down to a confrontation. And I have I have my own interpretation. If I were to put my tinfoil hat on, that Luke is actually the cosmic force within the galaxy attempting to support and change and rescue those within the galaxy. First, just R2D2, but his hand, which is a droid, which is so important in this story, his hand, which is the mechanical hand that was replaced in the end of Empire Strikes Back, and Zeta calls out that was a droid hand, is the piece that is interacting with the world, and in some ways could represent Rey or whoever is actioning in the world as the will of the Force.
The fact that Luke is part droid, if you will, in the way that Anakin is part man, part machine, is, obviously an important metaphor in the whole saga. But I think what I wanted to push here a little bit is the whole concept that other than Luke, nobody else saw the possibility of redeeming Anakin. And so the question is, do people see the possibility of redemption for other dark force users in here? Is it important to actually have that compassion, that ability to see? I mean, this is an issue that often gets fans very divided, because fans, a lot of us now are like, well, why do we think Anakin is a hero of some sort? He killed so many people. He's a terrible person, and he just ends up doing one good thing at the end, and now we're supposed to think he's awesome? That's ridiculous. Well, no, that's not the point. The point isn't somehow that one good thing redeems everything that comes before it, but it's the fact that we are not one unitary individual. We live our lives moment to moment, and the question is, can you at any moment choose to be someone that's different from all your past misdeeds? Zeta's problem is that, she said, I did so many terrible things, I'm just going to give in to it. I'm going to keep on doing terrible things. But that is not necessarily the only choice. You can always choose to do the right thing. It doesn't mean that it erases everything else that you've done before. But it is nonetheless the right thing to do. You still have to make that choice. And I think, the whole point of the story is all the other little droids are like, let's just destroy the enforcers, destroy them. But Luke is like, no, there's a possibility of redeeming
of saving
them.
Zeta. And redeem, and there's good in her. There's good in her. It's so good.
Very important.
But I want to say it goes past Anakin. Like, that's the key, is that, yes, Luke saves Anakin just like Luke saves Zeta. So we can say that that's the, metaphor. But it doesn't stop there.
It goes past that point, right?
Yes, because in Return of the Jedi, it doesn't fix the galaxy, and that's apparent because there's a sequel trilogy. And how does Luke and Zeta working together save the galaxy? Zeta points out that she caught the flaw in the logic of the dark
chip.
Right? The override chip has a parity gate, which can mean parity, can mean balance. Or equality.
Yes.
And Luke is able to, with this knowledge given to him by a dark force user, fix the problem in all of the force users, all of the galaxy, so that people have a choice.
Yes.
That's the point, is that we have to give people back the choice to do good and be good.
That's sort of the through line in the entire book. This is why Luke doesn't go after Reddy, because the point is, how can we compel people to tell the stories we want them to tell? That's never going to work. That's what the Empire does. We're not doing that.
Yeah, no, and this story blows my mind every time I read it. Feels right. It feels good. I love redemption stories. And the fact that Zeta just herself gets a redemption story, but it could be used as a metaphor for the larger saga. And also to say, hey, there's a potential here. Dark Force users, this is actually maybe how they feel on the inside, and that they
Yep.
don't feel like there's a way out because they're almost too trapped in this maze that they've built around themselves.
It's a trap of pain, right? I mean, you see that with Kylo very, very clearly. It's a maze of pain that they can't get out of.
Mm-hmm. And you see it very clearly with Anakin, and he's basically dead in some ways, like
Yes,
inside, and
yes, yes.
and but there's still this little bit of good, and I think that's so wonderful. And we actually see, like, a loss of limb, very much like Anakin, but like that we were able to save and redeem and rescue the whole galaxy, which is, to me, if it's not foreshadowing some sort of redemption arc for Kylo, or at least saying this is one potential path that it could take.
Yeah, I would take that approach. I mean, I think, the part about these stories that I enjoy most writing is putting in the little bit of um, uh,
What if?
what if, but
Yeah.
the little symbols, the sort of small metaphors that can stand in for much bigger things. I think Star Wars excels at that.
Mm-hmm.
It's in some ways a very old-fashioned story. It's not a
Yeah.
story meant for our post-ironic age in some ways. When Lucas was doing the saga, and for the creators who get what the whole effervescent giddiness is about, Star Wars is not a cynical story. It has never been a
Mm-hmm.
cynical story, never will be. It's not a story that's aimed at pleasing this very ironic age and post-ironic age that we live in. It's a
Yeah.
story that ultimately believes in the idea of very old symbols that can mean a lot. This whole idea
Mm-hmm.
of man versus man and machine, and Luke's
Mm-hmm.
hand. These are very, very large. You might even call them crude metaphors, very, very
Mm-hmm.
crude open metaphors, but that's why they are powerful. This is sort of like the way old epics are told. What is this thing about the golden apple that the goddesses compete over? What is this deal about dragging somebody's body around the city? These are very crude, open,
Yeah.
larger than life gestures, but that's the whole point. Star Wars is holding that mold. It's not meant to be a quote unquote realistic story in the way that we have been taught by modernism to expect. It's not about interiority. It's not about subtlety of this constant interrogation of the stream of consciousness. There's more than one mode to describe life, and this particular mode is about larger than life symbols, and symbols that recur and take on more meaning because they recur. The hand, the Lord Vader's helmet,
Mm-hmm.
the Kylo Ren
And
recovers.
masks are
Yes,
so fascinating in
so
Star Wars
important,
now.
right?
Yeah.
These things recur. They are huge, very obvious symbols, and my story, tries to tap into that tradition by having these symbols that are very obvious, like the fish and the spear. You point out, right?
Mm-hmm.
How can you possibly wield a kilometer-long spear and get a fish? That's kind of not the point, right? The point is, these are larger than life symbols, and they take on this meaning in this logic of metaphors, and that's how they make sense. And
It only makes sense when you kind of squint and you say, well, hey, like, what is it trying to say, rather than what is it telling
yes,
me?
it's not right. It's not about the literal fact themselves. That's really
Yeah.
not the point. The point is, what do these mystical, semi-mystical symbols mean? How do they function in this whole larger tapestry of symbols? And I think that's the mode that Star Wars works in. You have this background of very large, you might even call them naive symbols, overlaid on a layer of very sincere people trying to do the right thing, sincere men and women and droids trying to do the right thing.
Mm-hmm.
And when you put them together, that's what Star Wars is about. It's a story that has this larger symbolic metaphor that is full of just all kinds of grand meanings that we as fans can debate and build narratives of our own
Mm-hmm.
on top of. But ultimately, it's a story about sincerity. It's a story about believing the world is ultimately balanceable, that it is in fact a world that you can bring into the bounds.
And that the world doesn't have to be dark always and deep
Correct.
and covered in darkness, and that there's hope, and that there's redemption, and how many times they say hope in the saga itself.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. If you're the cynical type, you sort of see, well, this is completely ridiculous because there's no realistic plan. There's no realistic understanding of the complexity of the economy. Of galactic trade routes. How are we ever going to make this work? That's not the point. That's not the level at which the story functions. That's completely not the point. The point at which the story function is the stable boy at the end playing with those little figures, trying to imagine what it was like to be Luke Skywalker and what it's like for them to be Luke Skywalker. It's mythology, that's what it's about. And it has to be a story that is about sincerity, about the idea of trying to do good. I mean, I wrote the story to say there's good in everyone. And that's what Luke believed in.
And that was going to be my last question, which is, what is the most important message that you wanted to make sure that people got when reading this? And I think
that's really
that
pretty
is
much
it.
it. I think that's pretty much it. Yeah, that's what Luke believed in. It's what sustained him throughout his entire process. Even at the very end. I mean, if you follow through his journey from the very start to the very end, he never gave up on that. That is his whole entire point.
Mm-hmm. No, this is so wonderful. Is there anything else that you want to add to that? Okay.
That's it. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, no, Ken, I really loved this book. I think you can tell with I don't know that I got everything, but I think I got a good chunk of it.
I think you did. That was very cool.
Yeah. So thank you for coming on the show. I've really loved having you on the show, and just being able to actually talk to you about this. I feel sometimes like I'm crazy when I'm reading stuff and being like, is he talking about the saga?
I mean, this is what, what you saw is what I was trying to do. I wanted to layer it in these symbols about, how I thought about the saga and how I felt. It is in a lot of ways, a set of stories written really for the younger me. These are the stories that I would have loved to read when I was that age.
Well, and Rebels does this as well, which is trying to break down these concepts for a younger generation so that they can get it in, kind of from the source in the right way, so that they grow up with these concepts kind of given to them at the basest, base version. And this is going to be this could be somebody's introduction to Star Wars. And that's what I find is so wonderful. So thank you, Ken, for joining me and talking about the Legends of Luke Skywalker and your whole experience. Would you like to let people know where they can find you and what you got going on?
They can totally. So the easiest way to find out what's going on with me is to follow me on Twitter. I don't use it that actively, but I do respond to people who tweet at me. It's KYLIU99. That's my username on Twitter. You can also follow me on my website. It's kenliu.name, KENLIU.NAME. And you can sign up for my newsletter there, in which I announce new projects. While I may return to the Star Wars universe in the future to do something more, because I just love it so much. Meanwhile, I have an epic fantasy series going on, as well as a collection of short stories. So if you're into science fiction and fantasy, check them out. The short story collection is called The Paper Menagerie and Other Stories. And the epic fantasy series is called The Dandelion Dynasty, in which the first two books are The Grace of Kings and The Wall of Storms. And I'm working on the third book right now. These are fun stories because, as you can probably tell, I enjoy mixing sci-fi with fantasy. And so these epic fantasy stories are actually very much engineering focused. They're about fantasy engineering instead of pure magic. So if that sounds interesting to you, check them out.
Well, thank you very much for being on the show.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it.
This has been What the Force podcast We are available at whattheforce.ca, anywhere podcasts are found, and WT Force Show on Twitter. Feel free to reach out to us and start a conversation. Cheers!